The cowboy's hand shook when the black woman whispered what she wanted from him beside the stable lantern. "You make me lose control," Wade said, backing away from her like he'd touched fire. Snow whipped through the open barn door while a nervous horse stomped against the frozen boards behind them. Savannah still held the front of his coat in both hands, breathing hard, her cheek red from another man's strike only hours earlier. Then, hoofbeats echoed somewhere down the mountain trail again, and Wade reached for his gun before she could turn around. "Where are you listening from tonight?" The wind hit the cabin hard enough to rattle the lantern hanging beside the door. Wade Bennett shoved another log into the stove, pulled his coat tighter, and listened to the storm roll down Broken Pine Ridge like a living thing. Snow slammed against the windows in thick white bursts. Outside, one of the horses screamed. He was moving before the sound finished. The cabin door burst open under the wind. Cold air knifed through the room. Wade lowered his shoulder and pushed into the storm, boots sinking deep past his ankles. The lantern in his hand shook wildly, throwing weak yellow light across the snow. "Easy," he muttered toward the frightened horses near the fence line. The animals crowded together beside the pine rail, eyes rolling white. Wade grabbed the lead mare and guided her toward the shelter beside the barn. Snow coated his beard and shoulders before he reached the gate. Then he saw it, not far beyond the ridge trail, something dark against the snow. At first he thought it was a fallen branch. Then the wind shifted, and he saw the shape move. A horse lay frozen on its side, half buried already. Beside it, curled close against the animal's neck, was a woman. Wade stopped cold. For one long second the storm disappeared. All he heard was memory. A hospital room 11 winters ago, his wife burning with fever. The silence after her breathing stopped. The lantern nearly slipped from his hand. "Damn it," he rasped. He pushed forward through the drift. Snow clawed at his legs. The woman's fingers were locked around the dead horse's reins so tightly he had to pry them loose one at a time. She was light, too light. Her face was almost blue beneath the snow stuck to her skin. Dark curls clung frozen against her cheeks. Her lips trembled faintly, though her eyes stayed shut, still alive, barely. Wade wrapped his coat around her without thinking. The wind tore at them both as he lifted her against his chest. By the time he reached the cabin, his arms had gone numb. The door slammed shut behind him. Heat from the stove rolled across the room, carrying the smell of smoke, iron, and coffee grounds left from morning. Wade laid her carefully on the bed beside the wall. Her dress was soaked through. His jaw tightened. For years no one had crossed this room. No woman's voice. No second plate on the table. Nothing except winter and silence. Now this stranger lay shivering in his bed while snow battered the roof overhead. Wade dragged dry blankets from the chest near the stove. His movements stayed rough but careful. He turned his face aside while peeling away the frozen outer layers of her clothing, working fast before the cold stole what little warmth she had left. Her skin burned icy beneath his hands. "Stay with me," he muttered. The stove crackled louder. He wrapped her tightly, fed more wood into the fire, then filled a basin with warm water from the kettle hanging over the flame. Hours passed that way. The storm deepened. Wind screamed down the chimney. Wade sat beside the bed, changing cloths across her forehead, while the lantern flame dipped low and rose again. Near midnight she stirred, only a little, but her fingers suddenly caught the front of his shirt. Wade froze. Her voice barely existed beneath the storm. "Please," a weak breath. "Don't send me back." His chest tightened hard enough to hurt. She wasn't dreaming about snow. Even half-conscious, she sounded afraid of something far worse. Wade looked down at the stranger lying beneath his blankets. Water dripped slowly from the cloth in his hand. Beside the bed sat a worn leather satchel dusted with snow, one corner split open with folded papers barely visible inside. He didn't touch them. Outside, the blizzard swallowed the mountain whole. Inside, Wade Bennett remained beside the fire watching the woman sleep, listening to the sound of another person breathing in his cabin for the first time in 11 years. Morning came slow and gray. Snow covered the porch railing nearly halfway up the posts. Ice hung from the roof in long, crooked spears. Wade stepped outside before sunrise, split kindling beside the shed, then carried 2 buckets of water in from the pump before the top layer froze again. The woman still slept when he returned. Steam curled from the coffee pot on the stove. Wade poured himself half a cup and leaned one shoulder against the counter. The cabin smelled different now. Soap, damp wool drying near the fire, a faint scent from her hair still caught in the blankets. He didn't like noticing that. The bed creaked softly. Wade turned. Her eyes opened slowly, confused at first. Then fear flashed across her face so quickly it barely looked human. She pushed herself backward against the wall, breathing hard. "You're safe?" Wade said quietly. Her gaze darted toward the door, toward the window, toward the coat hanging beside the fireplace. Only after several seconds did her shoulders loosen a little. "You found me?" she asked. Near the south ridge. She looked down at her hands. Raw skin, torn nails, rope burns across her palms from the rains. "My horse?" Wade shook his head once. Silence settled between them. She swallowed hard but didn't cry. That seemed to surprise him. "I made stew," he said after a moment. "You should eat while it's warm." She hesitated before taking the bowl from him. Her fingers brushed his for half a second. Cold still lingered in them. "My name's Wade Bennett." She stared into the steam rising from the stew before answering. "Savannah, no last name." Wade noticed that too. The wind rattled the shutters again. Savannah flinched at the sound. Small movement, quick. Like her body had learned to expect trouble before it arrived. Wade looked away before she caught him, noticing. Over the next few days, the storm trapped them inside the cabin together. Wade slept on the old wooden chair beside the stove. Every morning before dawn, he fed the horses, chopped wood, checked the fences buried beneath snowdrifts, then returned with ice frozen into his beard and shoulders. Savannah moved slowly at first. Weak legs, careful breaths, one hand against walls when she crossed the room, but she hated sitting idle. On the 4th morning, Wade came in carrying saddle leather from the barn and found her crouched beside the stove, sewing a tear in one of his work shirts. "You don't need to do that," he said. "You needed it done." Her voice stayed soft but steady. Wade stood there a moment before hanging his gloves beside the door. That afternoon, he found his cracked coffee mug repaired with wire wrapped neatly around the handle. The next morning, his torn wool socks were drying beside the stove. Neither mentioned it. One night, the wind hit so hard the lantern flame suddenly died, throwing the cabin into darkness. Savannah startled. Without thinking, her hand caught Wade's wrist beside the table. He froze instantly. The room stayed dark except for the orange glow from the stove. Her fingers tightened once before she realized what she'd done. "Sorry," she whispered quickly, pulling away. But Wade still stood there unmoving. Her hand had been warm, too warm. After a long silence, he struck another match against the wall. The lantern flickered back to life between them. Neither looked directly at the other for the rest of supper. Later that night, Savannah finally fell asleep near the fire, wrapped in one of his blankets. Wade sat alone at the table, sharpening a pocket knife when the worn leather satchel beside the bed tipped sideways. Several folded papers slipped partly out. Wade stared at them, then slowly reached down. A marriage contract, official seal, witness signature, Jeremiah Voss. His jaw tightened as he kept reading. One line stopped him cold. "The bride shall obey all household arrangements determined by the husband." The paper crumpled slightly in his hand. Not marriage, ownership. Wade looked across the room toward Savannah, sleeping beside the stove. Firelight touched the side of her face. Even asleep, she looked tense, like somebody expecting footsteps outside a locked door. Something dark moved through him then. Anger, sharp and immediate. He folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the satchel before she woke. Near midnight, Wade pulled on his coat and stepped out toward the barn. Snow drifted quietly beneath the moonlight now. The storm had finally broken. Inside the stable, the horses shifted softly in their stalls, while Wade sat alone on an overturned feed bucket with a whiskey bottle hanging loose from one hand. First drink he'd touched in years. Back at the cabin window, Savannah stood wrapped in his blanket, watching the faint lantern glow from the barn through the falling snow. She didn't understand why he suddenly couldn't look at her anymore. But for the first time since reaching Broken Pine Ridge, the silence between them no longer felt simple. 3 days later, the roads finally opened enough for travel. Wade stood near the barn, tightening the leather strap beneath the sled while cold morning fog rolled through the trees. Snow still covered most of the ridge, though narrow tracks had begun cutting through the drifts toward Dry Hollow below. "You need medicine for that cough," he said, without facing her. Savannah pulled his coat tighter around herself. "I can stay here. You've been staying here." The words came rougher than he meant. He stopped working a moment later, jaw tightening beneath the stubble along his face. "I mean," he muttered, "you shouldn't be snowed in another week without supplies." Savannah nodded once. The ride down the mountain passed mostly in silence. The horses' breath steamed white in the cold, while the sled runners scraped over packed snow and frozen dirt. Pine branches hung heavy with ice above the trail. Savannah sat behind Wade beneath a wool blanket, one hand gripping the wooden side rail. Whenever the sled slid near the edge of the ridge, Dry Hollow appeared around midday. Smoke rose from chimneys along the narrow street. Men stood outside the blacksmith shop, warming hands near a barrel fire. Wagon wheels cut dark grooves through melting snow, and every head turned when Wade Bennett rode in with a woman beside him. Savannah felt it immediately. Eyes lingering too long. Whispers stopping halfway. Store windows shifting with shadows behind them. Wade climbed down first outside Whitmore General Store and offered her a hand without thinking. She hesitated only a second before taking it. Inside, the store smelled of flour sacks, lamp oil, leather gloves, and fresh coffee beans stacked near the back counter. Clara Whitmore looked up from weighing sugar into brown paper. For one surprised moment, she simply stared at Wade. "Well," the widow said slowly, "either hell froze solid, or you've decided to join civilization." Again, a faint sound almost escaped Wade's throat. Not quite a laugh. "Need coffee, salt, cough syrup." Clara nodded and began pulling supplies from shelves. Savannah wandered quietly toward the fabric table near the stove. She kept her eyes lowered while 2 women near the canned peaches whispered behind gloved hands. "That's her? The mountain girl?" "Another runaway woman, looks like." Savannah reached for a sack of flour. Her fingers trembled hard enough to spill white dust across the counter. Clara's sharp voice cut through the store before the women could continue. "If either of you plans on buying something, do it. Otherwise, stop crowding my aisles." The whispers stopped. Savannah murmured a quiet thank you, without looking up. Wade heard it all anyway. The ride home felt colder. Near sunset, Savannah finally spoke from beneath the blanket. "You don't have to keep doing this." Wade kept his eyes on the trail. "Doing what?" "Taking responsibility for me." The horse slowed slightly as they climbed the ridge. "I know people are talking," she continued softly. "You lived alone before I came here. Maybe I should leave before I ruin what's left of your peace." Wade pulled the reins too sharply. The sled jerked to a stop. Snow drifted around them in the fading light. Somewhere far off, a crow called through the trees. "You think that's what this is?" he asked quietly. Savannah looked down at her hands. "You won't even look at me anymore." That hit harder than he expected. Wade stepped down from the sled and stood facing the darkening woods for several long seconds before speaking again. "When my wife died," he said, "I buried everything with her. That's how I stayed alive after. Savannah stayed silent. Wade laughed once under his breath. Bitter sound. Empty. Then you showed up half frozen in my arms. And suddenly this place doesn't feel dead anymore. His shoulders tightened beneath his coat. That scares the hell out of me. Finally, he turned toward her. The cold wind moved loose strands of her hair across her face. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, wide and uncertain. "Why do you look at me like you regret saving me?" she whispered. Wade held her gaze too long, then finally said it. "Because every time you look at me," his voice roughened, "you make me lose control." Savannah's breath caught. Not lust alone. Something deeper. Lonelier. More dangerous. Like a man standing at the edge of life after years spent trying not to feel anything at all. Wade stepped closer before he could stop himself. "I want to touch you," he admitted quietly. "Want to keep you here. Want to hear somebody moving around that cabin 20 years from now." Savannah's eyes filled instantly. "And I don't know what to do with that." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could hide it. Wade lifted one hand slowly, brushing it away with his thumb. The world seemed to narrow around them. Snow falling softly, horse breathing behind them, evening light fading blue across the mountain. His face moved closer, so did hers. Then Wade saw it. The gold wedding band hanging from the leather cord beneath his shirt, his wife's ring. He pulled back sharply, like he'd touched fire. Silence crashed down between them. Savannah lowered her eyes first. After a long moment, she spoke in a shaking voice. "Jeremiah Voss didn't want a wife." Wade looked at her again. He wanted an heir. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "My stepfather owed him land near Wichita Crossing. Jeremiah offered to clear the debt if I married him and gave him a son." The wind moved harder through the trees. "I wasn't a woman to him," Savannah whispered. "Just part of the trade." Wade's jaw hardened. Before he could answer, a sound echoed faintly across the ridge. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. Wade turned instantly toward the trail below the cabin. 3 riders were climbing through the falling snow. At the front rode a tall man in a dark coat beneath a wide-brimmed black hat. Even from a distance, Savannah recognized him, her face drained of color. Wade pulled back the cabin curtain slowly as the riders stopped outside beneath the storm-dark sky. Jeremiah Voss had found the mountain. Snow swirled around the horses' legs while the men sat waiting near the gate. Jeremiah looked exactly the way Savannah remembered him. Clean black gloves, dark wool coat without a single loose thread, calm posture, like the storm itself had agreed not to touch him. The 2 riders beside him kept their hands near their holsters. Savannah stepped backward from the window so quickly her shoulder struck the table. "No," she whispered. Wade reached for the rifle hanging beside the door. A knock came 3 seconds later. Not loud, not angry, that somehow made it worse. Wade opened the door only halfway. Cold wind rushed inside. Jeremiah removed his gloves finger by finger before speaking. "Mr. Bennett." His voice stayed smooth as polished wood. "I apologize for arriving uninvited, but Miss Reed belongs under my protection." Savannah lowered her eyes instantly. Wade noticed that. "She ain't property," Wade said flatly. Jeremiah smiled faintly. "Legally speaking, she is under contract." One of the riders handed over folded papers, official seal, county signature, witness marks. Wade didn't move aside. "You tracked her through a blizzard over paperwork." Jeremiah finally looked past him toward Savannah standing near the stove. "She ran from an agreement that cost me a considerable amount of land and money." Savannah's hands shook beside her skirt. Wade saw it. So did Jeremiah. "Savannah," Jeremiah said gently, almost kindly, "come back now and this embarrassment ends quietly." For a second, the cabin held only the sound of wind against the walls. Then Savannah lifted her head. "No," small word, barely louder than the fire. But it changed something. Jeremiah's expression tightened for the first time. Wade shifted slightly, enough to block more of the doorway. "You heard her." The ranch owner studied him a long moment before slipping his gloves back on. "Sheriff Dalton Pike will settle this properly in Dry Hollow," he said calmly. "Until then, I'd advise you not to interfere with lawful matters." Then his eyes settled on Savannah once more. "You can't hide on this mountain forever." The riders turned and disappeared back into the snow, but the cabin no longer felt safe after they left. 2 mornings later, Savannah rode into Dry Hollow alone. Wade argued with her before sunrise beside the barn. "People there already decided what they think." "Then let them hear me speak for myself," she answered. He hated it because she was right. The town square sat crowded by noon. Wagons lined the church road. Men gathered outside the barber shop while women stood near the general store, pretending not to stare. Jeremiah waited beside the courthouse steps, holding the marriage contract beneath one arm. Sheriff Dalton Pike nearby, looking deeply uncomfortable. Savannah felt every eye on her as she crossed the square. Whispers followed. She stayed alone with him all winter. Poor Wade Bennett lost his mind. Jeremiah raised the contract for everyone to see. "This agreement was signed legally," he announced. Miss Reed fled before fulfilling her obligations. Savannah's face burned hot with shame. Then anger slowly steadied it. From inside her coat she pulled a worn ledger book tied with string. "I kept records for my stepfather," she said quietly. The crowd fell still. Savannah opened the book with trembling fingers. Names, debt amounts, land trades. Notes written in Jeremiah's own handwriting beside several young women's names. One line made Clara Whitmore cover her mouth. Another made an older rancher's face turn red with disgust. Savannah swallowed hard before reading aloud. "Bride expected to provide heir within first year of union." A murmur spread through the square. Jeremiah stepped toward her sharply. "You ungrateful little fool." Savannah didn't stop. "You bought debts from poor families and traded marriage contracts for land. Enough." His calm finally cracked. When Savannah tried turning another page, Jeremiah struck her across the face. The sound echoed through the square. Savannah stumbled sideways. Before she hit the ground, Wade caught her arm. Nobody had seen him arrive. He stood between them now. Broad shoulders, dark coat dusted with snow. One hand steadying Savannah behind him while the other rested low beside the revolver on his belt. He didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Jeremiah's riders shifted uneasily. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward at last. "That's enough," he barked. "This contract's under question now." Jeremiah stared in disbelief. Dalton held out his hand for the papers. "Looks an awful lot like coercion to me." The square erupted into whispers again, but different this time. Not against Savannah, against him. Jeremiah's face went pale with fury as Dalton folded the contract away. "This isn't finished," Jeremiah said coldly. Then he looked directly at Wade. "You think the mountain can protect her forever?" Wade's eyes never left his. "Far enough." Jeremiah mounted his horse without another word and rode out of Dry Hollow with his men behind him. Snow drifted lightly through the square after they disappeared. Savannah stood trembling beside Wade, one hand pressed against her cheek. The crowd slowly turned away. Clara Whitmore approached first, gently wrapping Savannah's scarf tighter around her shoulders before guiding her toward the warmth of the store. But later that night, after the mountain went quiet again, Savannah found Wade alone beside the stable lantern, brushing down one of the horses. He looked tired, more tired than angry. For a long moment, she simply stood there watching him. Then she crossed the snow. Wade turned just as Savannah reached up, caught the front of his coat softly in both hands, and kissed him before either of them could think twice. The stable lantern swayed overhead. For one stunned second, Wade forgot how to breathe. Savannah's lips were cold from the night air, trembling slightly against his, not demanding, not reckless, just honest. When she finally pulled back, her eyes stayed lowered. "I was tired of being afraid first," she whispered. Snow drifted quietly around them. Wade, looked at her like a man standing in front of something fragile and life-changing all at once. His rough hand lifted slowly to her cheek, where Jeremiah had struck her earlier that day. His thumb brushed the faint redness there. "You shouldn't have had to stand alone in that town." "I wasn't alone." The words settled deep inside him. Wade leaned down then and kissed her back properly this time. Slow, careful. Like a man relearning something he'd once believed buried forever. The horses shifted softly behind them. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, wind moved through the pines. But for the first time in years, Wade Bennett no longer felt cold. Winter loosened its grip little by little after that. Snow slid from the cabin roof in heavy sheets during the afternoons. Mud returned to the lower roads near Dry Hollow. The river behind the church broke open with loud cracks of ice drifting downstream. Savannah stayed. Not as a guest anymore. Her sewing basket appeared beside the fireplace. A blue shawl hung near the door beside Wade's coat. Some mornings she hummed softly while kneading biscuit dough near the stove, and Wade found himself slowing in the doorway just to listen before she noticed him. Life inside the cabin changed in small ways first. A second coffee cup left drying beside the sink, fresh curtains stitched from feed sacks over the window. Her laughter drifting from the barn when one stubborn mule stole Wade's hat and refused to give it back. Even Wade's brother noticed. Eli Bennett arrived one windy afternoon carrying fence snails and a sack of oats over his shoulder. He stopped dead halfway through the door when he saw Savannah sitting at the table, mending one of Wade's work shirts. "Well," Eli muttered slowly. "Guess the mountain finally thawed." Wade grunted and took the oats from him, though Savannah caught the corner of a smile hiding beneath his beard. Dry Hollow changed too. Clara Whitmore started setting aside fabric scraps for Savannah at the store. The preacher's wife invited her to help teach reading lessons for children after Sunday service. Folks still stared sometimes, but not the cruel way they had before. People had seen the truth in the town square, and they had seen Wade Bennett stand beside her without hesitation. One Sunday morning, nearly 5 months after the blizzard, Wade walked into church for the first time in over a decade. Conversation stopped when he entered. Snowmelt dripped from his boots onto the wooden floorboards. Savannah stood beside him wearing a dark green dress she had sewn herself from old fabric Clara gave her. Wade looked uncomfortable enough to bolt back outside. Savannah quietly slipped her hand into his. He stayed. That evening they rode together beyond the ridge trail, where the cemetery overlooked the valley. Wind moved gently through the dry grass around the stones. Wade stopped beside 2 graves beneath a pine tree. Mary Bennett, Thomas Bennett. Savannah said nothing. Wade removed his hat slowly. His voice came rougher than usual. "For years I thought if I loved somebody again," he swallowed once, "it meant I'd failed them somehow." The late sunlight stretched long across the hills. Somewhere below, cattle bells echoed faintly through the valley. Savannah stepped beside him and rested her hand over his. "They wouldn't want you buried with them," she said softly. "That did it." Wade bowed his head hard enough. His shoulders shook once beneath his coat. 11 years of silence cracked open there between the graves and the wind. Savannah didn't speak again. She only stayed beside him until the light faded. Spring came fully after that. Wade added new glass windows to the cabin before summer storms arrived. He rebuilt the front fence line with Eli and painted the porch rails for the first time since his wife died. And one evening, while Savannah stood folding clean laundry near the bed, she suddenly stopped moving. Wade looked up from carving wood near the stove. "You all right?" Her hand rested lightly against her stomach. Slowly she smiled. The cabin felt very still after that. Months later, snow returned again to Broken Pine Ridge. But this winter sounded different. Fire crackled warmly in the stove. A cradle Wade built by hand sat near the hearth. Outside, snow covered the world in white silence, while inside a baby's laugh rose bright and sudden through the room. Wade stood near the window, holding his daughter carefully against his chest like something sacred. Savannah rested beside the fire beneath a blanket, watching them both with tired eyes and a soft smile. The old cabin no longer smelled only of smoke and loneliness. Now there was coffee brewing before sunrise, soap drying near the wash basin, fresh bread cooling near the stove, baby blankets folded beside the rocking chair. A real home. Wade looked down at the little girl, gripping one finger of his rough hand, and shook his head quietly to himself. 11 years ago, he thought the mountain would be the place where the rest of his life disappeared. Instead, it became the place where it finally began again. Savannah met his eyes across the room. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Outside, snow covered the old tracks leading up the ridge. Inside, the cabin stayed warm. And maybe that's what stays with you after a story like this. Not the storm, not the fear, not even the loneliness those two carried that for so many years. It's the thought that somewhere in this world, a broken heart can still find its way back to life. Maybe you've known a winter like Wade Bennett did. Maybe not on a mountain in Montana, but somewhere quieter. A season where you stopped letting people get too close, because losing them once already hurt enough. And maybe you've known what Savannah felt too. That exhaustion of always running, always wondering if there's any place left where you can finally rest without fear. What makes this story linger is that neither of them healed the other with grand speeches. It happened in smaller ways. A warm stove before sunrise, a hand reaching back in the dark, somebody staying when leaving would have been easier. Sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it just sits beside you through the storm until the silence stops feeling empty. If this story meant something to you, leave a simple home in the comments. And if you'd like, stay a while longer. There are still more old trails, forgotten towns, and quiet hearts waiting to be found in the stories ahead.